Hello and welcome to another episode of the djproject Criterion Collection. And here we're going to talk about Spine 445, The Earrings of Madame de, directed by Max Ophüls, 1953. There actually was a reason why I got this film, is because I wanted to get into the films of Max Ophüls. When you get into the history of cinema and you start picking out key names, you have to find like Jean Renoir and Fritz Lang and Carl Theodor Dreyer and Orson Welles, and the list goes on and on. Max Ophüls shows up quite a bit for one big reason. He was the master of the tracking shot. If you love or hate films with cameras that seem to never want to stop moving, that is always following, that's always doing some kind of dance, you can blame a lot of that on Max Ophüls. In fact, he has influenced a great many of directors, including Paul Thomas Anderson, who provides an introduction to this particular film, and Stanley Kubrick was a big influence. He was tremendously indebted to Max Ophüls in terms of influencing his style, and you definitely see that carry over into his work. Now, the tracking shot is very easy. It's very easy to criticize, and it's also very easy to overdo it. But I feel that this is the reason why Ophüls is a master of it. At his time, he was often accused of overdoing it, and it's like his camera just never seems to stay still. Lindsay Anderson was a critic of, and in this film in particular, about how the camera never seems to stop moving. But the camera moves for a reason, and I believe that this has happened a few times where I've realized that the camera is in a sense another actor in the film, and plays just as big of a role as the actors that you see on screen. And depending on what the camera does, it will help you to feel a certain way, it will help you to gauge the image, it will help you to understand the image. There's a difference between when a camera is locked down and it stays, it stays on a particular shot, framed in a particular way, and then the action occurs within that shot. There's a difference between that and when a camera starts in one position and then pans and tilts to another. And thus there's a difference when it's handheld. There's a difference when it's placed on a Steadicam. And there's a difference when it's placed on a dolly or on a crane. It will, because it's because of the movement or the lack of movement, it will help you to feel in a certain way with it an image. And when it's done well, it can really it can really help bring out what you're trying to tell in the story. So, and yes, Ophüls did like to move his camera a lot, but he always felt that it had to be motivated by something. It wasn't just moving it for the sake of moving it. In fact, if anything, he would find stories that would help justify that sense of movement. And The Earrings of Madame de is an example of this. In fact, this was based on a novel written by Louise Levaquet de Vilmorin, who apparently was once engaged to Saint-Antoine d'Exupéry. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. My mistake. What fascinated him about the story, and this is his words, there's always the same axis around which the action continually turns like a carousel, a tiny, scarcely visible axis, a pair of earrings. I thought I said something else. Anyways, and the story itself is Madame de, and by the way, this actually reminds me of one of the things that frustrated me about trying to read Les Miserables is every now and then you would have I forget if it was a count or a baron or some aristocrat, but his title is censored. It's always like Baron de or Count de. I forget exactly what it was, but you don't know how the title is completed. And my assumption is that you want to, because you're dealing with perhaps you're dealing with actual aristocrats, you don't want to defame their honor or their character, and so it's just a way of just saving face. But in this story, I think it also works because one of the things you can get from this is that particularly since the story centers on her, and in particular her earrings, there's the notion that of possession of identity, and that the stuff that she thinks she has isn't really her own, and so why would you have any kind, and part of having a surname is having means of some kind of ownership, but she can't even really own her name. It was given to her by marriage, which leads into what the story is. Madame is, because of her lifestyle and her choices, she has a lot of debt, and one of the ways she pays off this debt is she sells her earrings, and particularly the earrings that was given to her as part of her dowry. And she even tries to disguise the fact that she had sold them by saying that, oh, I must have lost the earrings, and then it's taken even to more extremes to say that it was that they were stolen. This, of course, upsets the jeweler who has the earrings, and he says, no, they're not really stolen. Here, I'll just sell it back, and we'll call it even and such. And so the Monsieur de buys this off. By the way, Madame is played by Danielle Deriot, who was a frequent actress who worked with Max Ophüls. And according to PTA, the reason why you can get away with having these tracking shots or these shots that sort of fixate on her is because you really like her as an actress and a woman, and you get sort of fixated on her. But also, as other people have commented, this is not entirely on the male gaze. In fact, in some respects, the male gaze kind of gets inverted on itself, but slight digression. Anyways, so Madame is played by Danielle Deriot. Monsieur is played by Charles Boyer. So Monsieur buys off the earrings, and he gives the earrings to his mistress. So the mistress has them, and then she goes off to Constantinople, amasses her own gambling debts, has to sell off the earrings to pay those off, and then eventually the earrings ends up in the hands of an ambassador named Donate, played by Vittorio De Sica. Yes, the director of Bicycle Thieves is in this. In fact, it was said that Ophüls was very hesitant in actually giving him directions because this is the guy who made Bicycle Thieves. It's like, how can I direct another actor? How can I direct another director? Speaking of directors who are also actors, I forgot to mention this when I talked about If, but Lindsay Anderson was in Chariots of Fire, and he played one of the heads of Key's College, and he shows up in the very beginning of the story when all the students come in to start the new year, and he's talking about upholding tradition, and I just find that extremely amusing that this is the same guy who directed If, and it was all a critique about social tradition and following tradition blindly, and here he is, he's upholding this, and he also played along with John Gielgud as well, Sir John Gielgud, so so there you go, interesting little. It amuses me when I make these little connections. Anyways, back to Madame de. So the earrings end up with him, But then, by chance, he happens to see Madame and instantly is infatuated with her. And their paths cross again, and then there's gradually through some circumstances they develop an emotional affair. And it's also implied, at least PTA implies this, and I would say, yeah, that probably makes sense. There's also some physical affairs going on. And this, I won't give too much of the plot away, but it doesn't end particularly well. But one of the things that strikes me about this film is that, as I mentioned before, there is a point. I like that when there's a point to use a particular technique, and particularly in terms of camera moving. You know, when to move the camera, when not to move the camera. And in this case, this is justified because what Ophüls wanted to, I think what Ophüls wanted to convey was this ever-moving passion, this ever-moving emotion, and everything is certainly with the three main characters. It's all driven by various passions and various emotions. There's Madame's passions, there's Monsieur's passions, there's Donati's passions. In fact, the first time that they meet, you really, because of the way that the camera moves in one shot, and also in the sequence of shots, you know, it's because it's not just the shot itself; it's how you put the images together. You really get the sense that that Donate is attracted and to the, and it feels like a planet that, or it feels like a comet that just, or an asteroid that just barely missed the planet. Yes, this review is inspired by current events, but it's because an object of motion generates certain passions and emotions and forces that will then drive the rest of it. So it's all executed with the combination of camera movement and also the movement of the actors. That's the other component. It's not just the camera. That's why I call the camera an actor in of itself, because it's there in the scene, and it's there, and it also, the camera also has a relationship with the actors, and so so it's a matter of what kind of relationship are they. Is it more objective, which means it's locked down? It doesn't make any kind of overt judgments. It can, depending on how it's placed and what's depicted, but it's more or less subjective. Or does it move along with the characters, and thus is it more subjective? So, anyways, again, this is part of the reason why you see Max Ophüls films is to learn how to effectively make those shots and to have those shots work. And this is what makes him quite inspiring in a lot of ways. And later directors have picked up on this from Ophüls and then have used it in their own work. Again, I mentioned PTA and Stanley Kubrick. And they were both famous for using ever-moving cameras. And Martin Scorsese doesn't talk about him as much, but I wouldn't be surprised if he did. So I wouldn't be surprised if he played a role into it. I mentioned earlier that this is a film. Well, yeah, this is a film that, yes, uses the male gaze, but at the same time kind of inverts it on itself, where it's not so much the making the audience complicit in a gaze, but it's making us aware that there is a gaze going on. So in other words, it's more showing an interaction between characters rather than having us sympathize with the characters. And we see this, and in a sense, what this whole story is that we're seeing this dance in motion. We're not taking part in the dance, but we're seeing this dance at play. But the interesting thing is that the camera, when it does move, makes its own dance, and so we're more along with the camera. We have this. You could call it objective. You can call it God's eye view, but just something that helps tell the story without really having it be a part of the story, and at the same time helping to show what the story is about, or helping to show what the story is about. Yes, I can compose my thoughts. I've had a very long day in doing this. But anyways, so looking back, on the one hand, I think there was another Ophüls film that I wanted to get, which was Le Plaisir, which was actually the film that Stanley Kubrick has cited as one of his favorites. In an earlier time when he was giving interviews and he was listing off certain films. He also mentioned I Vitelloni by Fellini as another favorite of his, but he cites Le Plaisir as the Ophüls film that really made a big impression on him. It wasn't available at the time, so that's why I went with The Earrings of Madame de. Plus, also the other thing that sold me was that it had an introduction from PTA. Oh, I remember what else I was going to say. When I think of this film, I also think of Douglas Sirk as being a contemporary, similar filmmaker, in that they're both directors that are technically precise, and the image is really important. The composition is important. The way that what the camera does is really important. Ophüls, of course, has his camera move a lot more frequently and I would say to some extent more gracefully than Sirk. But there's certainly this desire to make sure that the image is there and says exactly what needs to be said. But it's there to tell a story, to make a point about other things. And in fact, this film in particular is cited as a kind of feminist film in disguise, because, as I said before, you don't know what Madame is Madame of. And you also get the sense that her life and everything is not really her own. The only thing that is her own is this love that she has with Donante. But then when it's found out by her husband, it's then thwarted. But then the other thing to keep in mind is that he has had an affair of himself. So that also gets into the issue of class morality and the basis of one's morality. It's the old this is for thee but not for me. In other words, I make the rules that apply to you, but they don't apply to me because I'm the author of these rules. I'm the one who's in charge. Monsieur is actually a general, so there's a military commentary. The story itself is set, I think, either before or after, or either before, after, or during. I know that doesn't really narrow it down, but I think it's around the Franco-Prussian War is when the story itself is supposed to take place. The original author was actually a 20th century author who also did some correspondence with Jean Cocteau, interestingly enough. So, at any rate, so it's in other words, it helps by seeing this story. You see there's layers of tragedy at play. There's the obvious one with her. There's the fact that she has these earrings coming back and forth within her life, and then the earrings in their own way playing a role in developing this affair, and then it leads to more tragedy. So it's like tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy, and it's and that is what I feel justifies the what can be called Baroque filming style with having a tracking camera and a moving camera, but it's all done to showcase the nature of passion, and I think that's what really drives the whole thing. It's what drives the story, and then you come away and again, the best art is what is a reflection of stuff back to us, and it's telling us that this is what happens. And then the question you ask yourself: do I continue down this path, or do I do something else? So. It sounds like I have a bit of ambivalence to it. I mean, this is a relatively more recent purchase. So unlike some other titles that have been with me for a while, that I've seen more times and have more things stuck into it, seep into me, and I've had more chance to think about it, I haven't really had a chance to think about this one as much. But I will say that I'm glad that I finally got a chance to know Ophüls. I do want to get Le Plaisir, and now that I know a bit more about him and his style and the way that he did things and so forth, I definitely want to check it out. So this happened to be my introduction to Ophüls. There's Le Plaisir and Lola Montez, and I think there's another one from Ophüls that came out, and this is all later Ophüls. This is in the 1950s. He was making films for quite a while. In fact, he even did a film adaptation of The Sorrows of Young Werther, which I would be interested in seeing at some point. But anyways, it's a really good introduction into his work. And again, if you want to know why some directors feel compelled to move the camera and why others don't feel compelled, you can pretty much put it all on Max Ophüls. So there you go. The Earrings of Madame de. And until next time, take care.